The invisible countdown. The silent ignition. February 2026. The world remained under the quiet veil of dawn, unaware that the gears of a global catastrophe had already begun to turn. At exactly 6 a.m., the heavy, salt-misted air of a restricted Israeli airbase was shattered. One by one, the engines of advanced stealth fighters ignited, their blue afterburners cutting through the morning haze like jagged glass. These were not just aircraft. They were the delivery systems for a new generation of long-range, high-precision munitions, weapons engineered for a single purpose: the decapitation of a nation's leadership. For the pilots, the mission briefing was short and the stakes were absolute. They were not merely flying a sortie, they were carrying the weight of a geopolitical earthquake. Every kilometer flown brought them closer to a moment that would effectively end a 40-year era of defiance. The Tehran convergence. Thousands of kilometers away, nestled in the densely packed urban labyrinth of Tehran, a fortified government compound near her square was buzzing with unusual activity. This complex, shielded by layers of reinforced concrete and elite security details, was the nerve center of the Islamic Republic. According to high-level signals intelligence intercepted by the CIA and processed in real time by Mossad, the unthinkable was happening: a full house meeting. For a rare, fleeting window of time, the supreme architect of Iran's regional strategy, Ayatollah Ali Khamenei, was physically present in the same room as his most vital commanders. This was a gathering of the old guard, the men who held the keys to the drone programs, the ballistic missile silos, and the proxy networks spanning from Yemen to Lebanon. To the intelligence analysts watching through satellite lenses, the compound looked like a hive, unaware that the predator was already mid-flight. The architecture of shadows. The success of Operation Epic Fury did not rely on brute force alone, but on a masterpiece of digital and human espionage. For over 18 months, Western intelligence agencies had been ghosting the supreme leader's inner circle. They had not only mapped the physical tunnels beneath the compound, but had successfully compromised the air-gapped communication systems used by the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, IRGC. Every time a high-ranking official moved, a digital footprint was logged in a windowless room in Virginia. The CIA had studied Khamenei's patterns so deeply they could predict his arrival times within a 3-minute margin. The decision to strike during the day was a calculated gamble. While a nighttime raid offered stealth, a daylight strike ensured that the targets were at their desks, in their meeting rooms, and most importantly, away from their residential bunkers. The order was clear: eliminate the brain, and the body will follow. 30 seconds of ruin. Saturday, February 28th. The local time in Tehran was 9:40 a.m. The city was mid-stride in its morning routine when the sky seemed to fold in on itself. The sound did not come first, the impact did. Israeli bunker-buster missiles, traveling at hypersonic speeds, slammed into the primary administrative wing of the compound. The physics of the strike were terrifying. The missiles were designed to delay their detonation until they had bored through several stories of earth and concrete, ensuring that no basement was deep enough to provide sanctuary. In less than half a minute, 3 successive waves of explosions reduced the heart of the Iranian government to a smoldering crater of twisted steel and pulverized stone. The collapse of the command. The initial reports from the ground were a litany of high-value casualties. 30 senior officials, the very men responsible for the country's national security and military doctrine, were vaporized instantly. As black, oily smoke began to choke the skyline of Tehran, the digital world exploded with raw, unverified footage of the devastation. Geolocation experts quickly confirmed the worst: the seat of power had been struck, and the supreme leader was silent. This was no longer a localized conflict or a series of surgical, shadow war maneuvers. The strike on the compound was the opening bell for a regional firestorm. With the command structure shattered, the question was no longer if Iran would retaliate, but who was even left to give the order. The world watched in breathless horror as the first domino fell, signaling the start of a chain reaction that threatened to draw every major superpower into the heat of a Third World War. Echoes of 1979. The roots of defiance. To understand the firestorm of 2026, one must look back nearly half a century to the winter of 1979. Before the revolution, Iran was a key Western ally in the Middle East, an authoritarian monarchy ruled by Shah Mohammad Reza Pahlavi. The Shah's regime was deeply entwined with American interests, fueled by oil wealth and a drive for rapid westernization. However, beneath the surface of modern skyscrapers and military parades, a tide of religious and social resentment was rising. When the monarchy was finally toppled in the Iranian Revolution, the geopolitical map of the world was redrawn overnight. Ayatollah Ruhollah Khomeini emerged from exile to transform the nation into the Islamic Republic, a state governed by strict religious law. This shift was more than a change in leadership, it was a total rejection of the West. The United States and its closest regional ally Israel were branded as the Great Satan and the Little Satan, transforming a former friendship into a permanent ideological war. The clerical ascent. When Ruhollah Khomeini passed away in 1989, the mantle of the revolution fell to Ali Khamenei. A cleric who had climbed through the turbulent ranks of the religious elite, Khamenei was determined to solidify the foundations his predecessor had built. Under his decades-long rule, Iran's opposition to Israel evolved from mere rhetoric into a sophisticated, multi-front strategic doctrine. Khamenei oversaw the creation and funding of a Ring of Fire, a network of powerful militias and proxy groups across Lebanon, Syria, Iraq, and Yemen. This strategy was designed to keep the conflict far from Iranian soil, using asymmetric warfare to challenge the military superiority of the US and Israel. 4 years, this shadow war was fought through assassinations, cyberattacks on infrastructure, and maritime skirmishes, but the true red line was always the same: the pursuit of nuclear technology. The nuclear brinkmanship. The tension reached a fever pitch in 2002 when satellite imagery and whistleblowers revealed that Iran was secretly enriching uranium at hidden facilities in Natanz and Iraq. While Tehran maintained that its nuclear program was strictly for peaceful energy and medical purposes, Western intelligence agencies were convinced it was a cover for the development of a nuclear warhead. This discovery triggered a 2-decade cycle of diplomacy and sabotage. The Obama administration's 2015 nuclear deal, the JCPOA, briefly offered a path toward de-escalation, trading sanctions relief for strict limits on Iran's nuclear activity. However, the fragile peace was shattered in 2018 when the Trump administration unilaterally withdrew from the agreement, reimposing maximum pressure sanctions that crippled the Iranian economy. By 2025, with negotiations stalled and centrifuges spinning at record speeds, the shadow war moved into the light. The year of breaking points. 2025 served as the grim prelude to the 2026 strike. In the summer of that year, the US and Israel launched a series of high-intensity air raids using specialized bunker buster bombs to target 3 of Iran's most critical nuclear sites. The physical damage to the facilities was extensive, but the psychological damage to the regime was even greater. Simultaneously, the Iranian domestic front began to crumble. The currency plummeted to historic lows, food prices tripled, and the civilian population, exhausted by decades of isolation, took to the streets. These were not just protests, they were an uprising. The regime's response was a brutal, nationwide crackdown that included a total internet blackout and the reported arrest of over 50,000 citizens. By the time the world reached February 2026, the Islamic Republic was a cornered animal, wounded by internal dissent and under constant external bombardment. The final diplomatic collapse. In the final weeks leading up to the February 28 strike, a last-ditch effort at diplomacy was made in the neutral territory of Geneva. On Thursday, February 26, high-level envoys met behind closed doors in a desperate attempt to pull back from the edge of a full-scale regional war. But the trust had been vaporized long ago. The US demanded a total dismantling of Iran's missile program, while Tehran demanded an immediate end to all military activity in the Persian Gulf. The talks collapsed within hours. As the diplomats left Geneva with no resolution, the military orders were signed in Washington and Tel Aviv. The history that began with the 1979 revolution was now hurtling toward a violent conclusion. The echoes of 1979 had finally reached a volume that the world could no longer ignore. The mechanics of destruction. The precision of epic fury. The strike on February 28, 2026, was not merely a display of power, it was a masterpiece of modern military engineering. As the Israeli F-35 Adir stealth fighters and American B-2 Spirits synchronized their entry into Iranian airspace, they utilized advanced electronic warfare suites to blind the aging S-300 and indigenous Bavar 373 air defense systems. The primary ordnance used was the GBU-72 Advanced 5K Penetrator. These 5,000-pound bunker busters are designed with a smart fuse system that calculates the density of the material it passes through. Instead of exploding on the roof of the government compound, the missiles bored through 10 meters of reinforced concrete and soil, detonating only when they reached the hollow command centers deep underground. This ensured that the shockwave was contained within the structure, maximizing the lethality for those inside while minimizing the collateral leveling of the surrounding civilian blocks in central Tehran. The decapitation strike. At exactly 9:40 a.m., the ground in the Valyasur district shook with the force of an earthquake. Inside the compound, the leadership of the Islamic Republic was in the middle of an emergency session regarding the failed Geneva talks. Witnesses later described a sound like a freight train slamming into the earth, followed by a series of muffled, bone-jarring thuds. The vacuum pressure created by the subterranean explosions caused the internal walls to collapse instantly. Ali Khamenei, along with his military advisors and the heads of the internal security apparatus, was buried under thousands of tons of debris. In the military world, this is known as a decapitation strike, an attack so sudden and so comprehensive that the nervous system of the nation is severed from its brain. For several minutes following the blast, there was no radio traffic, no emergency broadcast, and no orders given to the millions of Iranian soldiers stationed across the region. The second wave, blinding the giant. While the dust was still settling over the ruins of the compound, the second phase of the operation began. To prevent a coordinated counterattack, nearly 200 Israeli aircraft, the largest deployment in the history of the Israeli Air Force, swept across the western and central provinces. Their mission was to systematically dismantle Iran's eyes and ears. Radar stations, long-range early warning sensors, and surface-to-air missile batteries were targeted with AGM-88 HARM missiles, which home in on radar emissions. Within 20 minutes, the Iranian Air Force was effectively grounded, and the country's integrated air defense network was reduced to isolated, manually operated units. This blinding phase was crucial. It created a safe corridor for the third wave of heavy bombers and unmanned combat aerial vehicles, UCAVs, to enter deep into the Iranian interior. The American intervention. Approximately 30 minutes after the initial Israeli strike, the United States military officially entered the theater. Operating under the codename Stopping Roaring Lion, U.S. Central Command, CENTCOM, launched a massive barrage of over 150 Tomahawk cruise missiles from destroyers and submarines positioned in the Persian Gulf and the North Arabian Sea. Unlike the Israeli strikes, which focused on the leadership and the capital, American forces targeted the long-reach capabilities of the regime. Ballistic missile silos in the eastern deserts, drone manufacturing plants in Isfahan, and the Iranian Navy's fast-attack craft bases in Bandar Abbas were hit simultaneously. The U.S. Air Force also deployed the quick-sink weapon system against the Iranian fleet, effectively neutralizing their ability to close the Strait of Hormuz in the opening hour of the war. A nation in freefall. By 11 a.m., the structural integrity of the Iranian state had collapsed. While President Mossad Pezeshkian had survived the initial blast due to his location in a secondary administrative building, the loss of the supreme leader created an immediate constitutional and spiritual vacuum. In the streets of Tehran, panic mixed with a surreal sense of liberation. Some residents fled toward the mountains, fearing a nuclear follow-up, while others gathered in hushed groups, watching the black smoke rise from the seat of power. The IRGC, usually the iron fist of the regime, was in a state of total disarray. Their commanders were dead, their communications were jammed by sophisticated American glasshouse cyber payloads, and their soldiers were left waiting for orders that would never come. The mechanics of destruction had functioned perfectly, but as the first morning of the war ended, the world began to realize that destroying a government is far easier than managing the chaos that follows. The global chain reaction. The dying breath of command. As the first hour of the invasion drew to a close, the shattered remains of the Iranian military command activated Operation True Promise 4, a pre-programmed retaliatory protocol designed to be executed even if the central leadership was neutralized. From the underground missile cities carved into the Zagros Mountains, hundreds of mobile TEL, transporter erector launcher units emerged from their camouflage. These units, operated by mid-level IRGC officers who had survived the initial decapitation, began a synchronized launch sequence. Within minutes, the radar screens of every U.S. and Allied ship in the region lit up with hundreds of high-speed signatures. This was no longer a surgical strike, it was the beginning of a regional firestorm. The Siege of Israel. The primary weight of the retaliation was directed at the Israeli heartland. Over 200 medium-range ballistic missiles, including the hypersonic Fatah and the long-range Shahab-3, arched over the desert towards Tel Aviv, Haifa, and the Negev. Israel's multi-layered defense system, comprising the Iron Dome, David Sling, and the Arrow 3, engaged in the most intense aerial battle in human history. The night sky over Jerusalem was filled with the rhythmic booms of interceptions, looking like a canvas of artificial stars. While the majority were downed, the sheer volume of the saturation attack meant that several warheads slipped through, striking suburban areas and the outskirts of military airfields, marking the first time in decades that the Israeli home front faced such concentrated destruction. The Red Sea and the Gulf of Fire. Simultaneously, the conflict spilled into the world's most vital maritime arteries. In Yemen, the Houthi movement, loyal to the fallen supreme leader, announced an end to the fragile 2025 ceasefire. They deployed swarms of Mossad suicide drones and anti-ship cruise missiles against any vessel identified as Western-aligned. Within hours, a major oil tanker was struck near the Bab el-Mandeb Strait, sending a pillar of fire into the sky and effectively halting all commercial traffic through the Suez Canal. In the Persian Gulf, the Iranian Navy used swarm tactics, sending dozens of small, fast attack boats armed with mines and short-range missiles to harass the U.S. Fifth Fleet stationed in Bahrain. The goal was simple. If Iran was to fall, the global economy would be dragged down with it. The destruction of the oasis. Perhaps the most shocking escalation occurred at 2:15 p.m., when a wave of long-range drones struck Terminal 3 of Dubai International Airport. The symbol of global luxury and connectivity was turned into a scene of chaos as fires broke out across the tarmac. Nearby, the skyline of the UAE, including iconic structures like the Burj Al Arab, was shrouded in smoke from intercepted debris and direct impacts. In Qatar, over 60 ballistic missiles were fired at the Al Udeid Air Base, the largest U.S. military installation in the Middle East. While Patriot missile batteries intercepted most of the incoming fire, the falling shrapnel caused dozens of civilian injuries in nearby Doha. The message from the Provisional Iranian Command was clear: no neighbor who hosted American forces would remain a sanctuary. The global economic shock. As news of the closed straits and burning refineries hit the trading floors in London, New York, and Hong Kong, the world economy went into a tailspin. Oil prices surged by 40% in a single afternoon, surpassing $150 per barrel. Experts warned that the closure of the Strait of Hormuz, through which 20% of the world's petroleum passes, would lead to an immediate energy crisis. Around the globe, stock markets plummeted as the reality of a war of choice set in. From the streets of Washington, D.C. to the squares of Berlin, massive protests erupted. The world was divided. Some celebrated the fall of a theological regime, while others feared that the epic fury of the West had unlocked a cage that could never be closed again. The global chain reaction had begun, and the fallout was only just starting to settle. Power vacuum and domestic collapse. The shadow of the Ayatollah. With the confirmation of Ayatollah Ali Khamenei's death, Iran plunged into a structural and spiritual abyss. For over 3 decades, the supreme leader had been the ultimate arbiter of law, religion, and military strategy. His sudden removal created a vacuum that the country's constitution was ill-prepared to fill. While the assembly of experts scrambled to convene in a secret, hardened location, the streets of Tehran became a battlefield of ideologies. In the affluent northern districts, clandestine celebrations broke out, with citizens sensing the end of an era of isolation. However, in the working-class heartlands and among the devout, a profound sense of grief and fury took hold. The provisional government, led by a visibly shaken President Masoud Pezeshkian, struggled to maintain a facade of control while the very ground beneath the Islamic Republic began to fracture. The war within, Artesh versus IRGC. The most dangerous consequence of the decapitation strike was the immediate breakdown of trust between Iran's 2 military wings, the regular army, known as the Artesh, and the elite Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, IRGC. Without the supreme leader to act as the final authority, the IRGC, which controls the nation's missile programs and vast economic interests, refused to take orders from the civilian presidency. Internal skirmishes were reported at several checkpoints as IRGC units attempted to seize control of key communication hubs, fearing a coup by more moderate elements of the regular military. This internal power struggle crippled the national defense exactly when the country faced a third wave of Allied airstrikes, leaving vast sections of the border undefended and the command and control network in a state of total paralysis. The human toll. The Minab tragedy. While the world focused on the high-stakes movements of carrier groups and missile batteries, the human cost of the war hit a tragic peak in the southern Hormuzgan province. During the third wave of strikes, an Israeli missile targeted an Iranian naval intelligence center in the city of Minab. However, the strike resulted in a catastrophic error. the Sari-Teb Elementary School, located adjacent to the military facility, was caught in the blast radius. Iranian state media claimed that 175 people, mostly young girls, were killed instantly. While the U.S. Central Command immediately announced an investigation into the collateral damage, the images of the devastation flooded social media, becoming a rallying cry for anti-Western sentiment across the global South. The tragedy highlighted the grim reality of precision warfare in densely populated urban environments, turning a strategic victory into a moral nightmare for the Allied coalition. The sleeping giants, Russia and China. The strike on Tehran forced the world's other superpowers to abandon their neutrality. In Moscow, the Kremlin viewed the attack as a direct violation of international law and a threat to its own regional interests. Within hours, Russia began providing non-kinetic assistance to the remnants of the Iranian military, including high-level satellite intelligence and advanced electronic jamming equipment to counter Allied stealth technology. In Beijing, the tone was one of calculated alarm. China, which relies heavily on Iranian oil to fuel its economy, issued a stern condemnation at the UN Security Council, calling for an immediate ceasefire and the withdrawal of Western forces from the Persian Gulf. The Chinese Navy was put on high alert, and for the first time in history, the world faced the genuine prospect of a direct military confrontation between the United States and the Sino-Russian bloc. The precipice of World War III. By the evening of February 28, the epic fury of the morning had transformed into a global standoff. NATO senior commands moved their missile defense systems in Europe and Turkey to a state of maximum readiness, fearing that Iranian sleeper cells or Russian-backed proxies might launch retaliatory strikes against Western capitals. In the United States, the legalities of the war were already being heatedly debated in the halls of Congress. President Trump had initiated the strike without a formal declaration of war or congressional approval, leading to a constitutional crisis at home even as the military prepared for Phase 6. As the sun set over a burning Tehran, the question was no longer about the fate of the Islamic Republic, but whether the international order could survive the vacuum its fall had created. The world was no longer watching a regional conflict, it was witnessing the agonizing birth of a new, and far more dangerous, global reality. A message to eternity. The dawn of a new Iran. As the smoke cleared over the ruins of the Tehran compound, the immediate silence of the Islamic Republic's leadership was replaced by a cacophony of competing voices. The provisional government, led by Mossad Pezeshkian, found itself caught between the demands of a grieving, angry military and a civilian population that saw a fleeting chance for a different future. Within weeks, the rigid structures of the previous 4 decades began to erode. In the absence of the supreme leader's singular authority, local councils and student movements began to organize, demanding not just a change in leadership, but a total overhaul of the social contract. The world watched as Iran stood at a crossroads, one path leading toward a modern, secular democracy integrated with the global community, and the other toward a fractured state ruled by competing warlords and IRGC remnants. The economic aftershock. The global consequences of the Epic Fury operation were felt far beyond the borders of the Middle East. The closure of the Strait of Hormuz and the damage to the energy infrastructure of the Gulf triggered a global recession that experts predicted would last for a decade. While the U.S. and its allies eventually managed to reopen the shipping lanes through a massive, permanent naval presence, the risk premium on global trade remained at an all-time high. The era of cheap energy and seamless global logistics was effectively over. Nations that had once relied on Middle Eastern oil were forced into a chaotic and expensive transition toward alternative energy sources, fundamentally shifting the balance of global power and leaving the petrostates of the region to face an uncertain economic future. The verdict of history: necessity or choice. As the dust of the 2026 war settled, the debate over its legitimacy intensified in the international courts and the halls of the United Nations. Critics argued that the strike was a war of choice, a preemptive decapitation of a sovereign government that violated every tenet of international law. They pointed to the fact that Iran was still years away from a functional nuclear weapon and that the regime, while hostile, did not pose an imminent threat to the American mainland. Supporters, however, maintained it was a war of necessity, arguing that allowing the Islamic Republic to cross the nuclear threshold would have resulted in a far more catastrophic conflict in the future. The strike, they claimed, was a surgical removal of a cancer that had plagued the region for nearly half a century. The shadow of the Great Pyramid. In a strange philosophical parallel, the fall of the modern Iranian god-kings drew comparisons to the ancient dynasties of the pharaohs. Just as the Great Pyramids were built as messages to eternity, monuments to a power that the architects believed would never fade, the Islamic Republic had built its own monuments of ideology and military might. Yet, like the weathered casing stones of Giza, even the most formidable structures eventually succumb to the tides of time and the pressures of change. The 2026 strike served as a stark reminder that no regime, no matter how divinely ordained it claims to be, is immune to the forces of human agency and technological evolution. A world transformed. The message to eternity, left by the events of February 28, 2026, was one of profound caution. The world had witnessed the clinical destruction of a regional power, but it had also seen the fragile threads of global stability nearly snap under the strain. As a single, small human figure might stand before the Giza pyramids at night, looking up at the vastness of the Milky Way, the global community was left to reflect on its own place in the cosmos. We are a species capable of incredible architectural and technological feats, yet we remain perpetually trapped in the cycles of conflict that have defined our history since the dawn of civilization. Whether the fall of the supreme leader leads to a lasting peace or merely marks the beginning of a darker chapter remains a question that only the historians of the next century will be able to answer. For now, the world remains in a state of watchful, trembling hope.